Hey, what's up, guys? I hope everybody's Ramadan's going good. I just want to make a quick video about how Paul made up the death and resurrection of Jesus as opposed to the disciples. Who is Paul? Paul is somebody who never met the historical Jesus and was making up things about Jesus. So Paul is one of the founders of Christianity, or modern Christianity, that we know of today. We know that Paul wrote, I believe 7 epistles. So we know for certain that Paul wrote quite a bit of the New Testament that we have today. We know that, even according to conservative scholars, that Peter didn't write 1 Peter, James didn't write James, Peter didn't write 2 Peter, etc., etc. So none of the disciples actually wrote down any of the letters, and none of the letters can be traced back to the disciples. But anyways, that's besides the point. My point is, I want to talk about how Paul, and not the disciples of Jesus, made up the resurrection or the death and resurrection of Jesus. So here we go. We find this in Galatians chapter 1, verse 11 through 12. Paul says, "I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin." So that means Paul was not getting his information about Jesus' death and resurrection from the disciples or the apostles of Jesus. Notice what Paul says: "I preach is not of human origin." That means it didn't come from the disciples or the apostles. Galatians chapter 1 verse 12 says, "I did not receive it from any man." That means the disciples or the apostles. "Nor was I taught it." Again, that means he wasn't taught it by the disciples or the apostles. Rather, Paul says, "I received it by revelation of Jesus Christ." What is revelation? The Greek word for revelation is apocalypse. Apocalypse. So that means a vision or some kind of revelation. Now, Christian apologists usually say that, well, what about 1 Corinthians 15? Doesn't that shows that the disciples believed in Jesus' death and resurrection? Well, let's go to 1 Corinthians 15. Okay, now this is the important part. Now we're talking about 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 3 to 8. Now notice what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3. He says, "For what I received." Going back to Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 to 12, Paul says he didn't receive the gospel from any man, nor was he taught it, but by a revelation. That means Paul's own vision of Jesus. How do we know Paul got visions from Jesus? We don't know. He was probably making it up. But anyways, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried and he was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, which is Paul, and then the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time. Most of them were still living, though some had fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, another one of the apostles of Jesus. Then all of the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. Now, it's very important what Paul says in verses 3 to 4. He says that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. That means Paul's reading of the Old Testament. That's where Paul was getting this idea that Jesus died for our sins according to the Old Testament, not the disciples, not the apostles, and that he was buried and he was raised, that means resurrected, on the 3rd day according to the scriptures. So Paul, according to 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3 to 4, is getting his information from the Old Testament. And when he says, "For what I received," he's getting it from a revelation, a so-called revelation of Jesus Christ. That means Paul's information, or Paul's theology of Jesus dying and being resurrected, dying on the cross and being resurrected, is coming from his reading of the Old Testament and his own revelation or his own vision of Jesus. What that means is that Paul made up the death and resurrection of Jesus, not the disciples, using the Old Testament or his reading of the Old Testament and his own revelations or his own visions. So we know that Paul made up the story of Jesus' death and resurrection and not the disciples, as Paul was preaching away from the disciples. Paul was preaching in Rome, Galatia, which is modern day Turkey, So Paul was preaching away from the disciples. So who knows what the disciples were really teaching? It's possible that the disciples were teaching Jesus' disappearance and not his appearance, and Paul was teaching or preaching about Jesus' appearance. And we know this by looking at the Q Gospel. The Q Gospel talked about Jesus' disappearance and not his resurrection. If you want further information about the Q Gospel and how it talked about Jesus' disappearance from the tomb, I recommend reading Daniel A. Smith's book, The Q Gospel and the Empty Tomb, or the disappearance traditions in the Q Gospel by Daniel A. Smith, where he proves that the Q Gospel, which predates Paul, talks about Jesus' disappearance from the tomb as opposed to his reappearance, or as opposed to his resurrection. But that's besides the point. So the reason why this is important is because Paul was writing before the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Paul was the earliest writer of the New Testament. So it's possible that Paul's theology of Jesus' death and resurrection influenced the later Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And whatever the disciples were teaching or preaching about whatever the disciples were teaching about Jesus wasn't successful. And Paul's version of Christianity, or Paul's version of Jesus, was more successful than the disciples, and it was more popular, and that's what influenced the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. When the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John say Jesus died and was resurrected, it's coming from Paul's theology, and it's not coming from the disciples or the apostles' theology, because keep in mind, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were originally anonymous Greek documents, where later in the 2nd century they put those names. Yeah, this person wrote Mark, Matthew, etc., when in reality that wasn't really the case. So this is just my 2 cents on this whole thing. So Paul is the one who made up Jesus' death and resurrection, and not the apostles or not the disciples of Jesus. Stay tuned, more videos coming up ahead.